For over 2 centuries, the Melungeon people lived in the shadows of Appalachia, their true identity buried beneath layers of shame, silence, and deliberate forgetting. But now, as Tennessee's drought-stricken bluffs crack open, their ancestors are finally speaking, revealing a story of resilience that rewrites American history itself. This is the untold narrative of a people who existed in the cracks of colonial society, whose very presence challenged the racial categories that America fought so desperately to maintain. Their journey from invisibility to recognition is not just a tale of genealogy and DNA, but a profound testament to human survival against overwhelming odds. The Melungeons did not simply appear in the Appalachian Mountains one day with clear origins and defined purposes. Instead, they emerged slowly through the accumulation of choices made by individuals seeking refuge from a society that had no place for them. In the early colonial period, America was far more diverse than history books suggest. Free people of color, escaped slaves, indigenous peoples, and poor European settlers navigated an increasingly restrictive landscape. Virginia and North Carolina enacted laws attempting to categorize people into white, black, and Indian boxes. For those who did not fit neatly, the mountains became sanctuary. By 1813, when the term Melungeon first appeared in a Baptist church record in Scott County, Virginia, these communities had been established for generations in central Appalachia. The word itself carried immediate stigma, not a name these people chose, but a label applied as an insult, marking their in-between status in a society obsessed with racial purity. From the beginning, Melungeon identity was shaped by how others saw them, not by who they understood themselves to be. Yet, despite this prejudice, the Melungeons developed a distinct culture drawing from multiple traditions and ancestral memories. Geographically, these communities clustered in very specific areas, particularly around what is now known as Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, and the surrounding regions of eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. These were not haphazardly chosen locations. The mountains offered isolation, yes, but they also offered something more valuable: protection. In communities where racial laws grew increasingly severe, where free people of color faced constant threat of enslavement or economic destruction, and where mixed-race families lived in fear of legal persecution, the remote mountain regions provided space to build lives away, lives from the gaze of authorities and the judgment of mainstream society. The Melungeons became expert at farming the difficult mountain terrain, at hunting in the dense forests, at trading with nearby settlements while maintaining their distance from the center of colonial power. For generations, the story of the Melungeons remained shrouded in mystery and myth. Local folklore spun elaborate theories about their origins. Some claimed they were descendants of Portuguese sailors who had shipwrecked on American shores and intermarried with Native American tribes. Others suggested they were survivors from the lost Roanoke colony, a settlement that had vanished without a trace. More exotic theories emerged from popular imagination. Some believed the Melungeons were descended from Turkish or Ottoman populations, while others insisted they carried Gypsy or Romani heritage. A particularly persistent myth claimed they were an ancient indigenous people who had inhabited Appalachia long before European settlement. These stories, while capturing people's imaginations, obscured rather than revealed the truth about who the Melungeons actually were. The reality was simultaneously simpler and more complex than these romantic narratives suggested. The Melungeons were, fundamentally, a mixed-race population that had emerged through the natural mixing of different populations during the chaotic and violent early colonial period. They were the descendants of African men and European women, of indigenous peoples and colonists, of free people of color who had managed to establish themselves in the colonies before slavery became the defining institution of the South. They represented something that colonial society desperately wanted to erase from the historical record: the proof that racial categories were not natural or inevitable, but rather social constructions imposed by law and violence. The very existence of the Melungeons threatened the foundational myths upon which American racial hierarchy was built. As the 19th century progressed, the situation for Melungeon communities became increasingly difficult. The expansion of slavery, the hardening of racial laws, and the growth of white supremacist ideology all combined to make life in Appalachia more precarious. Many Melungeon families, seeking to protect themselves and their children from legal discrimination and social persecution, began to obscure their ancestry. They developed strategies of concealment that would persist for generations. Some families claimed Portuguese heritage, a claim that seemed more acceptable to white authorities than admitting African ancestry. Others simply refused to discuss their background, constructing walls of silence around their family histories. Census records from the period reflect this confusion and deliberate misrepresentation. Some Melungeons were recorded as white, others as mulatto or free person of color, still others as Indian. The inconsistency was not accidental, but rather a survival strategy. It was not until the late 19th century that the Melungeons began to receive significant attention from the wider world. In the 1890s, a female journalist named Will Allen Dromgoole traveled to East Tennessee and spent time in Melungeon communities. She wrote a series of newspaper articles that captured people's imaginations and transformed the Melungeons from local curiosities into a subject of national intrigue. Dromgoole's articles, while sympathetic in some ways, also perpetuated many of the stereotypes and exoticizing narratives that had long surrounded these communities. She described them as a strange, mysterious people dwelling in caves and hollers, isolated from the modern world. Her writing helped establish the Melungeons as one of America's great historical puzzles, a riddle waiting to be solved. Throughout most of the 20th century, Melungeon history remained largely confined to academic discussions and genealogical research conducted by determined descendants. The communities themselves continued to maintain their cultural practices and family traditions, passing down stories and knowledge through oral history, even as they worked to integrate into mainstream Appalachian society. Many Melungeon families moved to cities, particularly to industrial centers in Tennessee and Kentucky, seeking economic opportunities and a degree of anonymity that would allow them to escape the racial restrictions and social stigma that had marked their mountain communities. Yet even as they dispersed geographically, many maintained connections to their ancestral territories and continued to identify, at least privately, as Melungeon. The turning point came in the late 20th century with genetic technology revolution. DNA testing, affordable from the 1990s onward, allowed definitive ancestry questions to be answered. In 2012, geneticist Roberta Estes conducted a landmark study examining DNA from Melungeon families. The results revealed the truth was both simpler and more profound than anticipated. The genetic evidence showed Melungeons carried ancestry from three major groups: European, Sub-Saharan African, and Native American. However, distributions varied among individuals and families. Some showed predominantly European ancestry with significant African components. Others displayed different ratios, and some carried indigenous markers while others did not. This diversity reflected the reality that there was no single Melungeon origin story. Rather, the communities called Melungeon were composed of families with different ancestral paths that converged in the Appalachian Mountains over 2 centuries. Most significantly, DNA research confirmed what historians had long suspected but could not prove. Many Melungeon families had African ancestry. For generations, these families were taught to deny or hide this heritage, a denial rooted in racism and legal discrimination that made African ancestry dangerous and stigmatized. The genetic evidence brought this hidden truth into the open. Some descendants reacted with acceptance and relief, finally able to claim an identity their families had been forced to deny. Others found the results disturbing, their sense of self shaken by revelations they had been taught to conceal. The DNA studies transformed the mystery into something more personal and immediate. The research also revealed something perhaps even more important. There is no single DNA profile that defines Melungeons. This finding fundamentally challenges the way we think about ethnic and racial identity. Melungeons were not a distinct biological group with unique genetic markers. Rather, they were a social and cultural identity forged through shared experiences of marginalization, isolation, and the need to create community in the face of systemic exclusion. The DNA evidence supports this understanding. Melungeon identity, in its deepest sense, was not about genetics, but about history, culture, and the determination to maintain connection to family and community in circumstances designed to destroy both. The lived experience of Melungeons in the mountains reflected this reality. In communities like those on Newman's Ridge in Hancock County, Tennessee, generations of families created distinct cultural traditions that drew from multiple sources. Their music, for instance, carried influences from Appalachian folk traditions, African musical forms, and indigenous rhythms. The same was true of their foodways, their crafts, their religious practices, and their oral traditions. They developed a Creole culture that was genuinely their own, neither purely European, nor African, nor indigenous, but something entirely new, forged from the convergence of these different traditions under the pressure of shared circumstances and shared struggle. The physical characteristics attributed to Melungeons also reflected their mixed ancestry. Early descriptions often noted their olive-toned skin, dark hair, and distinctive facial features that did not fit neatly into contemporary racial categories. Some Melungeon families carried genetic markers associated with specific Mediterranean or Middle Eastern populations, leading some researchers and descendants to speculate about Turkish, Portuguese, or Iberian ancestry. More careful genetic analysis has revealed that these markers likely reflect the diverse origins of Melungeon ancestors, many of whom may have come from Mediterranean regions or from populations with historical connections to Mediterranean trade networks. This diversity of origins, when combined over generations through intermarriage and community formation, produced the distinctive appearance that characterized many Melungeon communities. One of the most intriguing aspects of Melungeon genetics relates to certain health conditions and physical traits that appear with elevated frequency in some Melungeon families. The genetic disease, thalassemia, an inherited blood disorder common among Mediterranean populations, appears in some Melungeon communities, suggesting ancestral connections to Mediterranean regions. Similarly, other genetic markers associated with Middle Eastern, Mediterranean, or Southern European populations have been identified in some Melungeon DNA samples. Some Melungeon families have also reported higher frequencies of polydactyly, the condition of being born with extra fingers or toes, as well as the distinctive physical feature, sometimes called an Anatolian bump, a bony prominence at the base of the skull. These genetic and physical markers provide tantalizing clues about ancestral populations, while also highlighting the dangers of making too many assumptions from limited genetic data. The connection between these genetic findings and the geographic origins of Melungeon ancestors has led researchers to propose various theories about Melungeon origins. Some researchers suggest that Melungeon ancestry may include people from Mediterranean regions, including possibly Ottoman territories, which would explain genetic markers associated with Mediterranean and Middle Eastern populations. This theory has gained traction in recent years as DNA research has become more sophisticated and as researchers have worked backward from genetic data to reconstruct potential ancestral populations. However, it is important to note that genetic ancestry is not the same as cultural or ethnic identity. A person might carry genetic markers associated with a particular geographic region without having any cultural connection to that region or having learned its languages, traditions, or belief systems. The story of how Melungeons came to Appalachia likely involved multiple pathways and multiple generations. Some may have been descended from free black people who established themselves in the colonies before slavery became the dominant labor system. Others may have descended from enslaved Africans who escaped from the coastal plantations of Virginia and North Carolina and found refuge in the mountains. Still others may have been products of relationships between European colonists and indigenous peoples. Some may indeed have been descendants of Portuguese or Spanish sailors or settlers, though the evidence for this remains speculative. The point is not to arrive at a single origin narrative, but rather to recognize that the Melungeons emerged through the complex mixing of populations in the chaotic environment of early colonial America. For much of the 20th century, this history remained largely hidden or denied. Melungeon communities persisted, but their story was not widely known or acknowledged. The communities themselves worked to integrate into broader Appalachian and American society, often at the cost of suppressing or denying the distinctive aspects of their heritage. Young people migrated out of the mountains to industrial cities, seeking economic opportunities and escape from the limited prospects available in rural Appalachia. As the century progressed, the distinctive Melungeon culture that had been maintained in isolated mountain communities began to fade, diluted by migration, intermarriage with other populations, and the homogenizing forces of mass culture and mass media. Yet something remarkable happened in the final years of the 20th century. As DNA technology made ancestry research easier and more affordable, and as the broader culture began to engage more seriously with questions of diversity and identity, Melungeon communities began to reclaim their heritage. In 1997, the first Melungeon Union was held, bringing together hundreds of descendants from across the country to celebrate their shared history and identity. This gathering represented a turning point, a moment when Melungeon people collectively decided to stop hiding their past, and instead to claim it with pride. Since that first union, annual gatherings have continued, drawing Melungeon descendants back to their ancestral territories and to communities like those on Newman's Ridge. This reclamation of Melungeon identity has been accompanied by an explosion of research, writing, and public discourse about Melungeon history and culture. Books have been published, documentaries have been produced, websites have been created, and academic conferences have been devoted to understanding this long-hidden chapter of American history. The Melungeon Heritage Association, founded to preserve and promote understanding of Melungeon culture and history, has become a vital force in this effort. The organization sponsors conferences, maintains archives, produces educational materials, and works to ensure that future generations understand and appreciate their Melungeon heritage. This institutional support has helped transform Melungeon identity from something shameful and hidden into something to be celebrated and preserved. The emergence of Melungeon pride and identity reclamation has paralleled broader transformations in American culture and understanding of race and ethnicity. The recognition that racial categories are social constructs rather than biological realities has made it easier for people to embrace mixed ancestry and hybrid identities. The civil rights movement and its aftermath created space for people to challenge the racial restrictions that had shaped their ancestors' lives. Genetic research has provided scientific evidence for what had long been suspected, that racial purity is a myth and that human ancestry is always mixed. In this context, Melungeon identity has become not an embarrassment but a source of pride, a testament to the resilience and adaptability of the human spirit in the face of oppression. However, the reclamation of Melungeon identity has not been without complications. Not all people with Melungeon ancestry are comfortable claiming this identity. Some families remain skeptical of the research or resistant to embracing a heritage their ancestors worked so hard to conceal. Others are unaware of their Melungeon connections, their ancestors having successfully hidden this aspect of their identity. Still, others have constructed new identities in their adopted communities and feel no particular connection to ancestral territories or communities. The Melungeon Heritage Association acknowledges this complexity, recognizing that Melungeon identity is not monolithic, but rather something that individuals and families must negotiate for themselves. The recent discoveries in Tennessee related to the drought have added a new dimension to our understanding of Melungeon history. When severe drought hit Tennessee in recent years, it caused the earth to crack and shrink in ways that revealed previously hidden archaeological sites and geological features. In some cases, the cracking of the bluffs and exposed rock faces have revealed caves and rock shelters that may have been occupied or used by Melungeon communities in previous centuries. Archaeological investigation of these sites has uncovered artifacts that provide material evidence of Melungeon life and occupation of the mountains. These discoveries are significant not because they solve the mystery of Melungeon origins, but because they provide tangible physical evidence of Melungeon presence and ways of living in Appalachia. The artifacts discovered in these drought-exposed sites include pottery, tools, remnants of dwellings, and other objects that testify to how Melungeon communities organized their lives and engaged with their environment. These material remains tell stories that written records often omit or distort. They reveal the sophistication of Melungeon agricultural and hunting practices, the care taken in constructing dwellings and communities, and the cultural values embedded in objects of daily use. Some discoveries have included evidence of artistic practices and craftwork, suggesting that Melungeon communities maintained rich cultural and aesthetic traditions. Others have revealed evidence of trade and exchange with neighboring communities, indicating that despite their reputation for isolation, Melungeons were actually integrated into broader networks of economic and social exchange. One particularly significant aspect of these archaeological discoveries has been evidence of religious practice and spiritual life in Melungeon communities. Some of the artifacts and sites suggest connections to Baptist and other Protestant traditions that were spreading through the Appalachian region during the 19th century. However, other evidence suggests the persistence of older religious practices and beliefs that may have roots in African, indigenous, or European folk traditions. This religious syncretism reflects the broader cultural reality that Melungeon communities were not static or unchanging, but rather dynamic and adaptive, integrating new influences while maintaining connections to older traditions. The Tennessee drought discoveries have also provided opportunities for new technological approaches to understanding Melungeon history. Advanced dating techniques, chemical analysis of artifacts, and DNA extraction from human remains found in archaeological contexts have all contributed to a more detailed and nuanced understanding of Melungeon communities over time. These scientific approaches complement traditional historical and genealogical research, providing multiple lines of evidence that converge to tell a more complete story. In some cases, the archaeological evidence has contradicted earlier assumptions based on oral tradition or written records, suggesting that Melungeon history is even more complex than previously thought. The significance of these discoveries extends beyond mere academic interest. For Melungeon descendants, the archaeological evidence provides validation of their ancestors' presence and importance in Appalachian history. For decades, Melungeon history was dismissed or minimized by mainstream scholars and institutions. The suggestion that Melungeons were simply mixed-race people with no distinctive culture or history of their own was common. The archaeological evidence contradicts this dismissal. It demonstrates that Melungeon communities were substantial, organized, culturally sophisticated, and worthy of serious historical attention. For descendants, this recognition can be profoundly meaningful, affirming the importance of their heritage and justifying the effort to preserve and study it. The story of how Melungeon history has been revealed and recovered over recent decades also tells us something important about the nature of historical knowledge and truth. For centuries, Melungeon history was obscured by myths, stereotypes, and deliberate suppression. It was invisible in mainstream historical narratives, relegated to folklore and local legend. The recovery of Melungeon history required a convergence of technological innovation, changing social attitudes, and the determination of descendants to claim and celebrate their heritage. Genetic research provided new tools for understanding ancestry. Improved archaeological methods revealed physical evidence of Melungeon occupation and settlement. Changing cultural attitudes made it possible for people to embrace hybrid and mixed identities without shame. Institutional support through organizations like the Melungeon Heritage Association provided resources and platforms for research and education. This process of historical recovery remains ongoing. New discoveries continue to be made as researchers apply new technologies and methodologies to understanding Melungeon history. Genetic research continues to become more sophisticated, allowing for ever finer distinctions in ancestral origins and population relationships. Archaeological investigations of newly discovered sites continue to reveal material evidence of Melungeon life. Genealogical research, aided by digitized historical records and online databases, continues to allow more and more people to trace their Melungeon ancestry with precision and confidence. Each new discovery adds to our understanding, filling in gaps and correcting misconceptions. Perhaps most importantly, the recovery of Melungeon history has profound implications for how we understand American history more broadly. The Melungeon story challenges the dominant narrative of American racial history as a simple binary conflict between white and black, European and African. It reveals the complexity, diversity, and hybridity that characterized early American society, particularly in regions like Appalachia that have often been represented as homogeneously white. It demonstrates that Native Americans, African Americans, and poor European Americans all played roles in creating new communities and cultures in colonial America, often in defiance of the racial restrictions being imposed from above. The Melungeons embody a kind of alternative American history, one in which different populations could come together, create communities together, and maintain cultural traditions together, at least temporarily, before the hardening of racial categories and laws made such mixing increasingly dangerous and illegal. The implications of this understanding extend into contemporary debates about race, identity, and belonging in America. The Melungeon story demonstrates that racial categories are not natural or inevitable, but rather constructed through law, violence, and the imposition of order from above. It shows that people can and do resist these imposed categories, creating communities and identities that challenge and transcend them. It reveals that many Americans, including those who identify as white or as members of other racial groups, carry ancestry that does not fit neatly into contemporary racial categories. This knowledge can be uncomfortable for those invested in maintaining racial hierarchies, but it is also potentially liberating for those interested in moving beyond rigid racial thinking. For Melungeon descendants specifically, the reclamation of their heritage has meant the retrieval of something precious that had been lost or deliberately suppressed: connection to ancestors and to the places where their ancestors lived and struggled. It has meant the opportunity to learn stories that had been hidden or passed down only in whispers and silences. It has meant the possibility of belonging to a community that understands and celebrates their distinctive heritage. For young Melungeons particularly, this sense of connection can be profoundly important, providing roots and identity at a time when such things can feel increasingly difficult to find in a mobile, globalized, often alienating modern world. The Melungeon Heritage Association and related organizations have worked hard to make this reclamation possible and meaningful. They have sponsored gatherings and conferences that bring descendants together. They have supported research and publication of books and articles about Melungeon history. They have created educational materials for schools and community organizations. They have worked with museums and historical societies to ensure that Melungeon history is represented and interpreted accurately. They have preserved documents, photographs, and oral histories. Through these efforts, they have transformed Melungeon history from something hidden and shameful into something visible and valued. The annual Melungeon gatherings that take place in places like Newman's Ridge in Tennessee have become important cultural events. Hundreds of people travel to these remote mountain communities to participate in celebrations that include traditional music and foodways, educational seminars and lectures, genealogical research workshops, and simply the opportunity to be with others who share their heritage and understand its significance. These gatherings serve multiple functions. They provide opportunities for people to deepen their knowledge of their history and roots. They allow people to connect with cousins and relatives they might not otherwise meet. They celebrate Melungeon culture and demonstrate its ongoing vitality. They serve as acts of reclamation and resistance, asserting the importance and dignity of Melungeon identity in a society that, for centuries, tried to deny and suppress it. The cultural traditions celebrated at gatherings include music, foodways, crafts, and storytelling. Music draws from Appalachian, African, and other traditions. Food and craft traditions reflect convergence of practices and mountain resources. Storytelling transmits history, values, and cultural knowledge. These practices keep Melungeon heritage alive and evolving. The recognition of Melungeon identity has prompted important conversations about Appalachian diversity. Long represented as uniformly white and culturally backward, Appalachia obscures its actual diversity. Melungeon history reveals African American, mixed race, and indigenous communities that have long been part of Appalachian life and culture, showing that Appalachian history is intertwined with African American and Native American histories in ways mainstream narratives overlook. When Appalachia is recognized as genuinely diverse with racial and cultural mixing, it becomes possible to think differently about contemporary racial dynamics. It becomes possible to recognize contributions of people from different backgrounds and understand how racism has been imposed, resisted, and challenged in the region, allowing us to imagine more inclusive and democratic Appalachian futures. The story of the Melungeons and the recovery of their history through genetic research, archaeological discovery, and genealogical investigation is ultimately a story about human resilience and the power of communities to resist and survive in the sea of oppressive systems. For centuries, the Melungeons lived in the margins of American society, their identity denied and suppressed, their history erased from official records and mainstream consciousness. Yet they persisted. They maintained their communities, passed down their stories and traditions, and kept alive a sense of identity and belonging even when the wider world tried to deny them both. In recent decades, particularly since the technological revolution in genetic analysis and the broader cultural shifts that have made hybrid identities more possible and celebrated, Melungeon descendants have reclaimed their heritage with pride. The discoveries related to Tennessee's drought represent just the latest chapter in this ongoing process of recovery and reclamation. The physical evidence revealed by cracked bluffs and exposed archaeological sites provides tangible confirmation of what genealogical and genetic research have already established, that Melungeon communities were real, substantial, and historically significant. These discoveries honor the memory of Melungeon ancestors and validate the efforts of contemporary descendants to understand and celebrate their heritage. They represent a kind of physical and material vindication of a history that had been denied and suppressed. Looking forward, the story of the Melungeons offers important lessons for contemporary America. It demonstrates that racial categories are not natural or inevitable, but rather constructed through specific historical processes and maintained through law and social practice. It shows that people have always resisted these imposed categories and created communities that transcend them. It reveals that American history is far more diverse, complicated, and mixed than dominant narratives acknowledge. It provides hope that alternative ways of organizing society, ways that value diversity and inclusion rather than hierarchy and exclusion, are possible. The Melungeons, who emerged from the margins and have now claimed their place in American history, testify to the possibility of transformation and the power of community and persistence. Their story is ultimately a story of American resilience and the enduring human capacity for creating meaning, community, and identity in the face of adversity and oppression.